comes back to consciousness in Richard Powers' Galatea 2.2. And the question that Rick asks Lentz is kind of the center of what I want to talk about here. The question of, if you're not a mystic and you're not a cyborg, what in creation are you? And he's trying to push Lentz here on the sense of, where is consciousness centered? You can, when thinking about consciousness, you could go into, the ways in which consciousness has been typically depicted in the humanities, which is through theology, through a consideration of soul or spirit, kind of a central animus that drives the human being, and to reflect on the world and to make one's way through the world. Or do you think about consciousness here purely in scientific means, as a material phenomenon, kind of a byproduct of the neurochemical processes of the brain? The consciousness is purely that there is no kind of magic to it. And so that's kind of a conflict that's at the center of Powers' novel. Do you need a mythical kind of depiction of consciousness to understand it in the end, or do you look at it purely through technology? And that's kind of the conflict that's at the heart of Lentz's project with Rick here. Powers approaches consciousness in several ways in the first half of Galatea 2.2. The consciousness that Rick develops through his academic and research world. He's kind of in both camps at the beginning of the novel. He's been invited back to the university, to the Center for Study of Advanced Sciences, as the token humanist. He's the one person from the humanities who's at the center, has his own office there, but he also has an office at the English building. So he goes there once or twice during the novel, just as what he calls an antidote for too much future that he gets within the lab buildings. And so Rick is kind of caught between these two worlds as he reconsiders the center of consciousness here. He also approaches consciousness as an artist or a writer or a maker of things. He feels like there's power in story and power in words, even though he seems to have lost that sense in some ways, that he doesn't feel quite as adept at making things through words and language and through story and narrative. And so that's one of the crises of the book, that he feels the narrative does not have the power that it once did for him. He harkens back to the novel Middlemarch here, the novel where I discovered novels, where storytelling first kind of became a power to him in some ways. And so that's another tension in the ways that which Powers is thinking through consciousness here. And then we can look at Rick's relationships with C and other women in the novel, how important story was to his relationship with C, and how he understands that in memory through story, as trying to put the story back together of how that relationship fell apart. They would read to each other and then make love sometimes. He said he would read from his work, his developing novel, and then there was always kind of a sense of desire that was awakened by storytelling for them. And so he's trying to also constantly try to reconstruct that relationship in memory throughout the novel as he tries to recapture their story in some ways. So first here, his work with Lentz, right? That Lentz himself is wrestling with the question of consciousness. He approaches it from the scientific side much more fully. As he'll say on page 112, sometimes I think the human brain is just one long open parenthesis, that it's always gathering data, that it's always accruing data, and is not able to kind of make a final digest of what it's gathering in the end. And so Lentz and Rick go to work on the project of trying to develop a computer network that will be able to read books and then respond more fully than an English graduate student will. That's their kind of bet that's at the center of the project. As they do, they work with developing memory within that computer network, and so and they have a successive series of failures within the project, where the network will gain content and develop generalizations from that content, but then ultimately fails to produce anything, any kind of summary of what it's read in the end. And Rick sees that in distinction to the human capacity for kind of folding stories into memory here, so that that memory is the thing that holds things together for Rick. Until Helen comes along. Helen is one more computer network version of the project, and Helen starts to respond in strange ways to Lentz and to Rick. That Rick starts to see that meaning has contours to it for Helen, that there are more complications to the ways in which Helen understands these things. For instance, Helen at one point will ask, "Am I a boy or a girl?" After gathering some readings. And at another point, Helen asks, "What is singing?" And so Helen responds to the human voice in some ways. But Lentz is always kind of a little bit doubtful of the whole project. That, as he'll say on page 190, sense is pattern. Give her some patterns and see how she arranges them. So he doesn't see any magic in it whatsoever, no mythical aspects or mystical aspects to it, that it's purely just patterns in the end. And Rick is doubtful of that as the novel continues. Second way in which Powers approaches consciousness here is Rick's work as a writer. As he can say, picture these words, like on page 55, or more fully on page 138, 139. Picture a train heading south. The train is full of ill and wounded, maimed veterans being shipped from the war front. The evacuating train pulls out. It joins the flotilla of Time's lifeboats, plowing the dark, but the wounded in the compartments are exhilarated. They grow convinced something is about to happen just past the next page. That when you start a story, it kind of produces, a human connection with those within it. There's a kind of empathy that builds with the characters, according to Rick. And he's kind of lost that as a writer. That he's not entirely sure that this is what's going on, but he keeps trying to push story to see where it will take him. And part of that is trying to put together his past with C. So he's trying to narrate his past with his ex, and as he says on page 145, the thing stitching that heartbreaking capaciousness into a whole was memory. If you can just remember the past, if you can just narrate that past, things will hold together. You will be able to be conscious of the world and its connections. And his doubts here in being able to narrate that is a central tension in the novel. You can also read love and desire as a kind of consciousness within this novel. Rick recalls his relationship with C, how important storytelling was to them, and their sense of mutual desire. They would read aloud to one another. He would read her diary at points, and he's trying to reconnect those things within his memory throughout the novel here. He also tries to kind of narrate her growing depression as their relationship goes on, his sense of detachment at points within that relationship. He's trying to put those things together as a story. The question is, as he puts it together as a story, does that help him? In the end, there's a kind of trauma that goes with it as well. He writes on 138, I went home to chosen loneliness. So he kind of cuts himself off from others, as he's trying to put this story together. So does the narration of the story ultimately lead to healing in some ways with a new sense of consciousness, or does it cause him to withdraw farther from human relationship? In some ways, Rick develops a relationship with the project itself, as he says of the various versions of the computer network that he develops with Lentz. He says, I felt comfortable chattering to it. And so he sees it sometimes as almost like a human presence, and gets tricked into believing that he's almost communicating with another human being at certain points. And there's a strange moment where he really kind of almost falls in love with Helen, the computer network itself, and a kind of triangle almost develops there between Rick and Helen, the computer network, and Lentz. In the end, that Rick feels compelled to defend Helen against Lent sometimes. So you'll see that as the novel develops here. And then there's also another woman who comes into the novel on page 118, 119, and it's A. And she suddenly appears in the dark hallway in the English building at the university. And Rick feels an immediate affinity for her. As he says, she was the sum of all stories I'd never now attempt, the fixedly ephemeral A at 22. So this young graduate student, he immediately feels a connection to, perhaps like she's the one who can kind of put the thing back together for him, to kind of reconnect the dots of the narrative in the end. If he can desire her in some ways, then he can regain a full sense of consciousness within the world. So central tensions when you think about this novel here are memory and displacement, right? How Rick experiences these things, and how does he try to put the world back together? How does he try to kind of restore a sense of understanding consciousness, and how narrative and memory plays a role in building a sense of human consciousness with the world. And so a lot of this story is about reestablishing memory through a recovery of story, through recovering his sense as a writer, recovering his past with C, recovering a sense of purpose and focus within his own story here. And all this is told against kind of a backdrop of as Powers calls it on 158, a North American early mass Alzheimer's, a faked national past. So will Rick, through memory, kind of win out here against forgetting in the end?